Let me drill down, though, a little bit on the risks. So this is just one framework for showing risk. There are many different ways that this could be done. As I said, like traditional apps definitely have a risk, and you need to consider those in your testing plan. But if I add LLMs in there, again, depending on my use cases, how I'm deploying this, who my end users are, I may have a whole wide range of risks that I need to consider as I build, deploy, and test my application.
Synthedia.
So Chris runs the AI and strategic accounts at Applause. And if you don't know Applause, I think he'll tell you a little bit about it, but they're sort of the biggest provider of human testing for sort of these for applications that we all use, many of which I'm sure you will be very, very familiar with. I don't know, we'll get into it today. But he has a lot of really interesting things to share around how testing for applications might, from a traditional standpoint, might differ a little bit from what we're seeing with LLM. So Chris, I'll let you take it away.
Really what I wanted to do today was to share our perspective on testing LLM-powered applications. And our perspective has really been shaped by working with some of the largest organizations in this area this year. And I'd have to say, like, there are a lot of similarities to normal QA testing for traditional apps, but there are some major differences that you should be aware of. Before I get into that, though, let me sort of just introduce Applause and kind of where we fit into the AI landscape. So we are a crowd testing company. We have a global community of over 1 million members. We've been testing digital applications and digital experiences now for over 15 years. And so we have a very robust QA digital testing practice. We also have a user research practice and then the AI practice. With the AI, for many years, we have been providing human source data collection to power AI models to help train them, to help fine-tune them. Now that generative AI has come along this year, we use that expertise, along with the expertise that we have on the QA side and the user research side, to effectively build custom testing solutions for LLM-based apps. And we've done a lot of this, like we've used over 15,000 testers this year to test LLM-based apps. And I'm going to share what we've learned in that journey. Before I get into testing, though, I thought it may be interesting to share some of the things we're seeing in the marketplace. There's a little bit of a context and a backdrop. This slide here is what I would call kind of looking at it from the supply side, the folks that are creating infrastructure or creating applications around Gen AI. So the Gen AI infrastructure build out is happening at an unbelievable pace. And you'll hear a lot about that today from folks speaking at this event. But what that is enabling is most of the software companies, whether they're B2B, whether they're consumer oriented, are rapidly adding Gen AI LLM-based features into their existing products and their existing workflows. And we at Applause actually have done that ourselves. We've added LLM feature into our testing application. The other area that there's a lot of action and sort of accelerating is on the developer tool side, often referred to as developer tools 2.0. So everyone's sort of familiar with the co-pilots, but a lot of intelligence is being built into all aspects of the development pipeline. So those three areas are happening very rapidly. And then we come to the enterprise brands. And I would say that's a little bit slower. And the excitement level and the interest level is extremely high. But I think we're still in the learning, experimentation, pilot phase. And so that's like, what are the use cases? What data do I use? How do I use my internal data? What is the business value and how do I mitigate risks? So there's a lot of sort of exploration and pilots, often internal pilots that are going on. I do think 2024 is kind of going to be the breakout year that we're going to see brands bringing to market large scale enabled AI LLM based features and applications. If I flip to like the demand side, like, and I often get this question, is like, okay, there's a lot of activity, people building stuff and infrastructure, but are people actually using this technology? And so this is just a very simple way of sort of looking at the market, consumers, developers, and sort of the end users of brands. If I look at the consumer space first, the answer is yes. The general LLM chatbots dominate the market. We've actually done user research in this area, and kind of what we've seen from our research is when the chatbots initially came out, there was a great deal of excitement. A lot of people signed up, but then you saw a real drop in sort of retention and usage. But what our research is showing now is a lot of people are getting comfortable with the technology and are starting to incorporate it in their daily lives, which is what you want as a consumer application. You want it to become a daily habit. And so we're starting to see that emerge, and it's both work and non-work use cases. And underneath that, there's lots of different ways that people are starting to use the chatbots.
I want to pull this thread a little bit if you
Yep.
let me jump in
Go for it.
as well. So so when you think about this, any type of application has initial interest and then fall off. Do you have any perspective, and maybe you don't, about how this is different or similar to other applications, and maybe any other insights that you maybe have around intensity of use?
Yeah, if I had like a whiteboard, I'd draw like there's a huge spike,
Yes.
which is very different than traditional, which is little.
Yeah.
The drop off is much more dramatic, and now the pickup in actual daily usage. So it's like this exaggerated, compressed cycle that you like if it was other types of applications or technologies, it would be happening over a longer span of time.
Yes.
And the cycle would be the top and the bottom would be far less.
It's like the wine bottle approach, whether normally it'd be like the wine bottle would be on its side, and that's what you would see, not as much variation versus it's like the wine bottle in this case is vertical. It's just like sharp up,
Yes,
sharp
yeah,
down.
I like the wine bottle analogy, and I think it's going to accelerate for a couple of reasons. And most of these providers now are adding voice, which I think is a very compelling. And then I think you're going to see this extend out to different form factors. And so the one that just got recently announced is like Meta smart glasses that incorporates
Yes.
their LLMAA capability. I think like that is a perfect form factor with voice for interacting in the world. So I think as these things get developed, I think you're going to see that acceleration.
Awesome.
You're
Okay.
also seeing kind of the fun, the entertainment side as this technology goes. I think everyone is familiar with the success of Character.ai. I think we'll see those sort of things continue. We saw the curve on image generation go up, come down, but now we're starting to see that specifically. I think people are the fun, yes, okay, but now I can actually seriously use it in my workflow. And so we're starting to see that come through.
Yeah, image generation, I think, looks like the hype cycle, right? It's sort of like the Gartner hype cycle. It's a very
Yes, very much
steep
so.
drop off, and now we're sort of entering that plateau productivity. From a well, I'm going to ask you about the entertainment side later. I'll let you continue with your presentation.
Okay.
Thanks for humoring me there.
The other one, I mean, we talk to developers all day long in our business, and nearly all of the conversations we have, they either have adopted or are planning to adopt. I mean, Copilot's a basic, but again, the developer adoption is happening fairly rapidly. When I talk about brand and user adoption, again, it's going back to the supply side, our brand. And when I talk about brands, e-commerce, banking, mobile, all of this, the adoption is lagging because we haven't seen necessarily a lot of large scale deployments. Most of the deployments that we're seeing is sort of internal. And an example would be, hey, I have a marketing team, creative team, maybe 20 people, and I want to have quicker and better image generation built into their workflow. So an internal team. So we're seeing that. I do think 2024 is going to be the year that we're going to see end user adoption across many different industries. So let me now dive into testing. So when you come to testing traditional apps versus LLM apps or features embedded into your traditional app, there really are two main differences that you need to consider. The first is around the inputs and the outputs. With LLM, it's variable. Brett and I may have the same intent, but the way that we put the prompts in are very different. and the outputs we get are very different. Or we could phrase them very similar and change the parameters. The output becomes very different. With a traditional app, again, the way you sort of do testing, you have sort of almost expected input and expected result. So if I'm testing a mobile app, I will have a certain set of steps and a journey, and I will expect a certain result. And if I don't get that, it's actually failed. The other area is in risk. So traditional apps definitely have risk, for sure. But with the LLM, again, it depends on the use case and the end users. Your risk profile tends to be higher, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But kind of what all of this means is that when you look at a test plan for a traditional app, so let's just say we are testing a mobile application, I will have a very traditional approach: automation, human scripted testing, human exploratory testing. And I may test that with a small team. I may only need a dozen people. And what I'm trying to optimize is to make sure I test on all the devices and the operating systems that my end users are using. When it comes to LLM, the test plan is different. And we'll go into detail on that. The team is also different. In short, larger, more diverse team. And I'll explain why in a minute. Let me drill down, though, a little bit on the risks. So this is just one framework for showing risk. There are many different ways that this could be done. As I said, like traditional apps definitely have a risk, and you need to consider those in your testing plan. But if I add LLMs in there, again, depending on my use cases, how I'm deploying this, who my end users are, I may have a whole wide range of risks that I need to consider as I build, deploy, and test my application. So with that sort of backdrop, what we're seeing when we come to work with some of the larger organizations across their Gen AI lifecycle is human testing really gets inserted into three main points. So on the model training, again, like the prompt engineering, fine tuning, a lot of iteration happening. You'll see humans inserted there. It could be for creating prompts. It could be for writing prompt answers. And the well-known technique of reinforcement learning happens here. So that's a good point. But what I'm mainly talking about today in this presentation, and where we really help a lot of companies, is the pre-launch and the post-launch. How do you build an effective testing program, given the different nature of the application and given the different nature of the risks that you're faced with? So I think I mentioned at the start, like we've done testing with over 15,000 testers on large language model-based applications. And I think there's two key things that we've learned. Scale and diversity in your testing team does lower risk and does improve performance. And at a very minimum, you should be focusing your testing on three key areas. So let's drill into each of those. What do we mean by scale and diversity? So scale is the number of people that I want on my testing team. So I talked about before, like a typical mobile testing team, I may only need a dozen people, and that's fine. It has everything covered. I've got my devices and OSs covered. When it comes to my large language model, again, it'll depend by the use case and what the end users are. But I generally will want, as a rule of thumb, as many people, just quoting, like banging away using the application because of the variability in the technology. You can have low risk that happens frequently. You can have high impact risk that happens just very infrequently. Your best chances of capturing those high impact risks is to use a large team. A large team could be 50 people, could be 100 people. We've run teams of thousands over several weeks, like testing over 4 or 5 weeks, because it's a general application to the general population, and we want as many people actually working and testing on the application. When it comes to diversity, I think of diversity along sort of 3 dimensions. There's the diversity of things like age, gender, race. And the reason why those are important is, like, I may see an output and think, okay, that's benign, but someone else from a different age, a different ethnicity may look at it and say, no, that's actually harmful. And the only way that you can capture that is to have diversity in your team. And then when we do the testing, we see that. We do see that this output over here is fine for this population, but put in front of a different group, it's considered toxic or harmful or biased. And so you want to be able to surface that as much as possible. The next area is if your LLM feature or app is domain specific. That could be by subject, it could be by function. You definitely want experts in there. The final one is location. So again, this is sort of just best practices. If you are internationalizing your app, you're putting into other countries, again, because of the variability, you want to be sensitive about the cultural context. And you want to have people that are actually in the market, speak the language, know the culture, being able to test the applications to be able to flag those sort of issues. So then, like, okay, what should we test? Now, there's many areas that you should test, but what we've learned is there's really 3 key areas that you need to focus on. So you get this testing team. The first area, and really the most important, is the prompt input responses. You want as much usage going through the system to try and identify those risks that we talked about, performance issues, inaccuracies. Typically, when we start out, we may have the team saying, hey, here's the application, just use it as you naturally would in the real world. And that is interesting by itself. Like, how do people actually use it? What are the type of prompts they're putting in, use cases, and so forth? We then may move to being a more directed. More directed could be, I want you to put very complex prompts in, multi-turn prompts. I want to see how the system reacts to that kind of interaction. And then finally, we may do adversarial type testing. I can guarantee, like, if you have a general public type LLM app and you put it out there, immediately there's going to be a group of people that will want to try and break it. And so adversarial or red team testing, as it's often called, is where you deliberately try to generate content that may be offensive or harmful. And so that is adversarial testing. So you do all of these techniques in the testing program. User feedback, we've found, is really important. The reason for that kind of goes back to some of the comments I made about where the market is at the moment. So the market, like from a technical feasibility perspective, is that you can build these apps all day long. The next wave, and we're starting to see it, but is the retention, adoption, actually getting value out of these applications. And so if you've got a large team using your application and testing it, it is also a great time to capture user feedback. Do they like it? Are they satisfied? Do they find it trustworthy? Would they use it again? There's sort of many user feedback signals that you can get. So again, in our experience, customers either put this into the application themselves or will do it ourselves, but this feedback is extremely useful. The final part is just traditional QA. Again, you have real world testing. You will find a bunch of issues in these applications, as you will in all applications. And so obviously you want to fix those critical issues. So final slide here. So like we've talked about the differences, we've talked about a different approach in terms of the testing and team size. Like the $1 million question is like, well, does this actually help at the end of the day? Like, what's our experience as being? So what we've seen, again, when we do the testing, it's not like a one-off, we'll do it over a period of time. We have seen that the number of reported issues for bias, harmful, inaccurate responses does decrease over time. And the reason for that is obviously the model is learning, it's fine-tuning, it's getting better, but also the developers are taking all of this input. They're building rules in, content filtering, all of that based on the input that's coming in. As far as the user experience, this is just one data point. We ran testing over a 5-week period for a chatbot. There was a lot of development going on, like a lot of product feedback coming in, but we did see satisfaction as measured by an NPS score actually increase 4 points during that period of time, which in that short period of time is actually pretty significant. And then finally, in all the testing we've done, absolutely, we are finding real world critical bugs that do need to get fixed.
All right. That's great. I really appreciate you talking about that. We had a couple comments in the chat as well about the fact that this is such a important concept that almost nobody's talking about. In fact, Jillian Kirsch just said, "This is awesome, Chris. Thanks." And she has a UX design background, being particularly important. A couple things I just wanted to unpack a little bit with you. So first of all, inputs and outputs being really important here. So we have variable inputs. We've seen that before in other applications, which truly unique is variable outputs. That's super hard. And I want to talk about this in terms of scale and diversity of testing in particular, because we think about this output scenario. Sam Altman from OpenAI has talked about this. He's just like, okay, on Twitter, you're going to see, the examples that are number, 9,998 and 9,999 in 10,000 out of 10,000 trials, because most of the time, the LLM outputs are really pretty consistent, maybe benign, useful, but yes, they do have errors. And whether he's right on those numbers or not, or whether it's 10 or 15%, is sort of irrelevant. The point is that you've got this normal distribution, and the problems tend to be long tail problems. So they tend to be like infrequent. If you don't have scale in your testing, if you don't have scale in the diversity of your groups within the testing demographic, whatever the diversity is, you might never see those, even though that they exist. They might get served to you and it's not a problem for you, but might not get served to the person where it is a problem.
Yeah, 100% correct. And that's why you want that diversity. So you start with who are the end users of the application, like who's going to be seeing the output and putting the prompts in. And then you want to work backwards from that. So we've had examples where we've worked with some of our clients. And so they've been concerned about things like, when we built this and sort of did some internal testing, we didn't feel we were well represented in some of the minority groups. Could be LGBTQ, could be Native American Indians. And they're aware that as we put a testing panel together, like make sure that you have a lot of those people in there, because we want that perspective, because we're driving blind. We just don't know. And so that's really the only way, is to make sure you have representation. And so like, that's where you get the social norms coming in. That's where you get responsible AI coming in. You get representation from all of these different groups. And like I said, like if you're putting this out to the general public, we've seen the press. There will be people out there from day one that will try to reverse engineer and try to create something sensational to show you that it's harmful, it's toxic, it's whatever it is, and then it's suddenly on the front page of wherever. So again, you want to try to mitigate that. The final part is, this is kind of where the UX comes in. I mean, you see it with all large. I mean, there's a lot of disclaimers and all of that, but there's ways that you can walk people, both existing users and new users, to explain that it's not always going to be accurate. There's ways that you can build in, if you do see something that's harmful, that you can immediately let them know and inform them. So those are sort of the best practices around the user experience. And so if you do the testing and you build the user experience right, you sort of got your bases covered as best as can be in the current state of the technology.
Yeah, and Steve King was asking about the biggest constraint for enterprise adoption. And it'll be interesting to hear your perspective, because you're working with a lot of enterprises. You're working with the people who are providing applications, as well as the people who are like adopting the technology to provide some sort of new capability for their customers. And that risk slide sort of stands out when I think about that, in terms of, yes, we can adopt the technology. There's lots of things that we can do, but I'm seeing a lot of organizations say, okay, how are we going to manage these risks? How are we going to ensure that the incidents that do occur at least are minimized or mitigated?
Mm-hmm. Well, one of the things right now that's happening within the larger enterprises is sort of like, who actually owns Gen AI? So when you think about it, is it IT? Is it business? Is it compliance?
Yeah, sure.
Is it legal? Like there's multiple parties that need to be at the table. And it's sort of sometimes a little bit unclear, like who actually owns it and who's going to be responsible. And everyone's sort of, obviously the legal team and compliance is trying to minimize risk. Someone else might be trying to maximize the launch. So I do see that happening in conversations. And so part of it for us is coming in and having more of a balanced conversation because you're not going to eliminate the risks. It's really hard to do. But what is a best way from a testing and a feedback to try and minimize? So just internally, the dynamics is sort of one of the barriers there that are slowing down some of the adoption.
And are you seeing a difference in like entertainment oriented, productivity oriented, service oriented features with LMs, either in terms of the way your testers are reacting or the way your customers are thinking about them in the market?
The research testing we've done on the entertainment one's kind of interesting. I can't unfortunately put myself in this demographic, but the younger demographic loves it. So we've actually had some testing where here's a normal, assistant, and here's one that has some fun entertainment. Almost universally, this one, the fun entertainment one, is the one that I like and I want to use, and all sorts of things. And that's coming from the younger demographic. As we sort of like in my demographic, I'm like driven by different things.
Yes.
Are you accurate and so forth? But the younger demographic definitely likes the avatars, the fun, the entertainment, the characters, and things like that. So we do see that coming through in the research work we're doing.
Got it. And I think there's going to be more research out from Applause coming up. I think you have some papers being written and those types of things.
Yes.
So people should definitely look at that. Anything else you want to leave people with as we conclude our discussion today?
No, I appreciate the time, and I would just say, like, to everyone in the audience, this is a very fast-moving, interesting, but it's also complicated space. So happy to have just a conversation and help people through it, because there's lots of different things happening out there in the marketplace.
That's good. And I want to have you back for some things too, because I think there's a lot of questions. There's a lot that just popped up, like, around healthcare and all these other things. So we'll do something else where we can allow people to talk more about this, because, testing, it's like not as explored as much in the LLM space, but we're at the point now where everyone's trying to bring this to production, and all of a sudden it's your system tests are inadequate. You actually need human user testing as well. So
yeah, it's the right time to have this conversation.
So. Awesome. All right. Thanks, Chris. Great. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Brett.
Synthedia, the business and technology of generative AI. Generative AI, synthetic media, large language models, image generators, virtual humans, voice clones, deepfakes, ChatGPT, and more.